This conference will now be recorded.
So yes, I'm Karen Chapman from MRPC. We have Chris Kutchman and Nate Carlucci here from DHCD to give a 20-minute presentation on the new MBTA communities law, and then we're going to have a question and answer session. If you'd like to type your question in the chat, we'll answer them after the presentation. And so I'll turn it over to Chris.
Karen, thank you so very much. And to everybody in your region, hello and greetings. I'm looking forward to the time when we can come back out in person. I miss going around the Commonwealth and meeting folks in their place where you're used to being. But for now, we'll be on the Brady Bunch screen here. My colleague Nate Carlucci and I are going to give a PowerPoint that's going to walk through the basics of the new Section 3A to Chapter 40A, which is otherwise known as the Zoning Act. As Karen said, you can put your questions into the chat, or after we're done, you can raise your hand and we'll just answer your questions. We are, in addition to this recording, we're also going to send the slideshow so that the slide deck will be available for you, either posted on their website or just sent email to you. I'm really grateful for those of you who are watching now and those of you who are watching the recording. One of the things I want to start out by saying is recognizing that although we work, for the state and the Commonwealth, that we are familiar with local issues, and we appreciate that everyone here is at the local level and all of the hard work that you do to implement new laws like this, and that these are not easy topics to talk about in your communities. I also want to just acknowledge that this is a brand new regulatory program, and that it makes it difficult. There are complicated things to understand and just, get your head wrapped around. And then, you have to explain it to your communities. And I appreciate how difficult that is. I think, one thing is you think back 50 years ago, Chapter 40B was put in place, and everybody had to figure out how it was going to work for literally just what were the rules? What was a subsidized housing inventory? What was an affordable unit? How does 10% calculated? When does it change? What's a safe harbor? All of those things are topics that were not familiar to people at the time, and people had to learn it. Once people learned those rules, they had to learn about how to be strategic about implementing the rules and how it was implemented in your community. 20 years ago, Chapter 40R was introduced with a smart growth zoning overlay district. This is an optional program, but also one that has a fairly complicated set of rules and regulations. And again, people have to understand them to be able to understand how they're going to affect your community or how it might apply to your community. So I just want to say that at the state, we understand these things. We understand that it's difficult. And we hope that the guidelines are going to provide both a clear and flexible approach to providing for these multifamily districts so that you can comply with this state mandatory law. Nate, if you want to bring up the presentation, we're going to walk through our PowerPoint. And I do want to say we have not used GoToMeeting in the past, so if we have a little bit of technical difficulties, please bear with us. That looks great, Nate. Thank you. You can just run the slideshow, then that'll be perfect. Awesome. So next slide, please. So I do want to start out, many presentations that I've given in the past talk about and provide lots and lots of data about why the Commonwealth is in a housing crisis even before COVID, all of the data. I'll just briefly say that it is our, and we have many of those presentations on our website at mass.gov, but just to cut to the heart of the matter, it is our perspective that over the last generation or 30 years, the Commonwealth has been underbuilding the supply of housing that it needs. If you look at the 30 years prior to that, the Commonwealth communities built 900,000 new units. In the last 30 years, we've only built just over 450,000, so just over half. So we really have a supply problem throughout the Commonwealth to accommodate new folks. The MBTA Communities Law, or Section 3A, is super important to have a new conversation about planning for housing around transit, where there is transit, and where there is not transit, putting multifamily housing zoning in the right place. Most of that multifamily housing that's produced is produced in Boston and immediate surrounding areas. And we're hoping that this new law allows you to have the conversations, new conversations, and establishes, frankly, a new paradigm for talking about housing in your communities. Next slide. Just a brief recap about how we got to where we are. Back in early January 2021, the governor signed the 2020 Economic Development Bond Bill, which included this new law, Section 3A of the Zoning Act. In December of 2021, we came out with draft guidelines and started a public comment period. We had lots of great comments, almost 400. We did webinars with all the RPAs and interest groups. We got lots of comments. In fact, I think your regional planning commission did submit comments. We took those to heart. Many things that we heard included comments from smaller communities, and communities that told us about on-the-ground problems and concerns and issues that did not match multifamily zoning. And so we made pretty significant changes, especially for those small and rural communities, and issued the final guidelines in August of this year. Now here we are in November, where we will be continue to issue important pieces of compliance for the guidelines, which is the compliance model, which we'll talk about, Nate will talk about, actually I'll talk about later in the presentation. And then I'm just on this timeline, I've put the next major deadline, which is January 31st, 2023, which is a deadline for municipalities to submit an action plan form to the state. Nate's going to talk in detail about what that is and other deadlines that apply. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Nate now, who's going to walk you through the guidelines.
Thanks, Chris. Sorry, thanks for bearing with me, everybody. I'm getting acclimated to this software here, and I'm trying to unmute while continuing the slideshow. So as Chris said, we're going to do a little walkthrough here of both the statute and the guidelines, but mostly the guidelines here and the way that they sort of interpret the language that's in the statute. So I like to start with this slide here that breaks down the 3 paragraphs from Section 3A. Really, all of the zoning content from the statute is there in the first paragraph. There are a lot of terms there that we're open to interpretation, such as the requirement that a district be reasonable size, that you're meeting the definition of multifamily housing, the housing is allowed as of right, there's a gross density requirement of 15 units per acre, and you have to sort through the location requirement of what it means to have a requirement to be located half a mile from a transit station if applicable. The second paragraph of the statute lays out the 3 funding sources that are at stake in terms of compliance, and the final paragraph tasks DHCD with developing the program's guidelines. Sort of the first major thing that the guidelines do is they take all of the MBTA communities and they divide them into 4 community categories. When you're thinking about what an MBTA community actually is, it's a definition that really existed before Section 3A. It's the communities that are in the MBTA service district, and they are named in Chapter 161A. A good rule of thumb that works in most, but not quite all cases, is that it's a community that either has an MBTA fixed transit station or it's adjacent to one that does. So the guidelines attempt to apply these zoning requirements to 175 plus very different communities. And that's the reason why the communities are divided into these 4 community category types: rapid transit, commuter rail, adjacent communities, and adjacent small towns. There's an important concept in these guidelines that's important to understand for a lot of the requirements, and that's the concept of developable station area. Um, that's referring to developable land located within a half-mile radius of a transit station. And it's that developable station area that determines what community category an MBTA community belongs to. The threshold to fall into one of those categories is 100 acres of developable station area. So for example, a community would have to have 100 acres of developable station area from an MBTA rapid transit station to belong to that category. Same thing with the commuter rail community, at least 100 acres of developable station area from a commuter rail station. About half of all the MBTA communities actually don't have 100 acres of developable station area, and in many cases, they don't have a transit station in their community. So those communities are adjacent communities. And if they also are small towns, meaning that they have a population of 7,000 year-round residents or fewer, or a population density of less than 500 people per square mile, then they become an adjacent small town. This table here lays out the basic differences in the requirements based on community categories. The first requirement of the zoning districts is that they are of a reasonable size. And reasonable size consists of both land area and the unit capacity, meaning the number of housing units that could be developed based on the zoning. For the land area requirement, in most cases, there's a base requirement for a 50-acre zone. There's some exceptions to that. The major exception is that for adjacent small towns, there's no land area requirement at all, no minimum land area requirement. The reason for that is because adjacent small towns tend to have low unit capacities, and the statute requires zoning at 15 units per acre. So with the land area requirement multiplied by that gross density, the towns would otherwise have a requirement above what this next calculation we're going to present would give you. So for this unit capacity calculation, you can see a formula below the table. The basic calculation for unit capacity is the community's 2020 housing stock from the decennial census multiplied by the percentage listed in row 2 of the table. So for example, a adjacent community would be its 2020 housing stock times 10%. There are location requirements for communities that are rapid transit or commuter rail communities. Those we'll go over in more detail on the following slides, but there are no specific district location requirements for adjacent communities or adjacent small towns. Finally, I want to note that the deadline for adopting a compliant zoning district differs by the community category. So the rapid transit communities, there's only 12 of them, but they have a deadline at the end of 2023. Most MBTA communities are either commuter rail or adjacent. They have until the end of 2024. And finally, the adjacent small towns get an extra year until the end of 2025. When we talk about unit capacity, a really common question that we get is, what is the impact of existing development on the calculation of unit capacity? The answer is that existing development is actually not considered in the unit capacity measurement. It's just a measurement of the zoning. So you can see in the example at the bottom of this slide, if there's a parcel that has an existing duplex on it, but the zoning would allow for 4 units to be built there, then the unit capacity is 4. Even if that parcel was vacant, if the zoning allowed for 4 units, its unit capacity is 4. I'm just going to quickly go over a couple examples of district location requirements. This first example is coming from Arlington. You can see on the map on the right, in the lower right corner of Arlington, there's a darker green circle. That's representing station area from Alewife Station in Cambridge. There's actually under 100 acres of developable station area there. So that's not enough for Arlington to have a belong to the rapid transit category. So Arlington is actually an adjacent community. And you can compare that to the table on the left, which determines how much of a district needs to be located in a station area based on the number of acres of developable station area that the community has. And to give you an example of one that does have a requirement there, we'll use Needham, which has a ton of developable station area, over 1,200 acres. So you take the 1,200 acres that Needham has, and you look at the table on the left, and you see that for communities with 801 or more acres of developable station area, they need to locate 90% of their zoning district in the station area. That 90% requirement refers to their minimum land area and their minimum unit capacity requirements. That's different than the contiguity requirements of the guidelines. There are a couple requirements about the contiguity of these zoning districts. Communities can have districts that exist in multiple geographies. You can do it just through one base district appearing in multiple places, an overlay district appearing in multiple places. You can have sub-districts, but there's two key rules, and the first one is that 50% of the adopted district needs to be contiguous. The purpose of that is to promote neighborhood scale planning. So while the district location requirements are tied to minimum requirements, the contiguity requirement is tied to the actual size of the adopted district. The other requirement is that any separate geography of the district needs to be at least 5 acres in order to contribute to the minimum land area requirement. And again, that's to promote the neighborhood scale planning rather than individual project sites. There is a little exception to that second rule there for communities that have very low unit capacity requirements. If they can meet their unit capacity requirement with less than 5 acres, then that district obviously will count towards their requirements. So I want to talk about what multifamily housing actually is as defined in the statute. There is a definition of multifamily housing in Chapter 40A, Section 1A, and it's met in two ways, either with a building that has 3 or more residential dwelling units, or with a lot that has at least 2 duplexes on the same lot. And when you think about what the multifamily housing might look like that results from this definition and from the statute's gross density requirement, think about the image that's on the bottom of this slide that's showing that missing middle housing in the middle there. Obviously, multifamily housing is not the detached single family houses that we see on the left, but it's also not the mid-rise development that we see on the right. That's significantly more than 15 units per acre. So these building types that you're looking at in the middle for the middle missing housing are really what this program is getting at for its requirements. I want to talk a little bit about as of right zoning and how do you stay true to the definition of as of right zoning with the requirements in your district. We get a lot of questions about site plan review. Site plan review is allowed with a Section 3A district as long as it doesn't impose any unreasonable requirements or undue delays on projects. A big topic is affordability. Many communities want to require affordability within their 3A districts, or they have inclusionary zoning throughout their community and they want it to apply within their 3A districts. We actually made some revisions to the guidelines on October 21st that expanded communities' abilities to require affordability in their 3A districts. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, but for now, I'll just note that any community may require that up to 10% of units in a project are affordable at 80% of the area median income. And there are 2 exceptions to that rule that allow communities to require more affordability. The statute prohibits mandatory mixed-use development from qualifying as of right multifamily housing. It defines mixed-use development separately from multifamily housing, and it's that standalone multifamily that does need to be allowed as of right. So you can allow mixed-use development in a 3A district. In fact, you can allow anything in addition to the actual required multifamily housing in the district. You can incentivize a retail or commercial component, but you just can't require it in the 3A district, or it won't satisfy the statute's requirements. And finally, I just want to note for energy efficiency, there's a basic requirement that multifamily housing in the district cannot be required to meet higher standards than other uses in the municipality, such as single family housing. So this slide has a little bit more detail on the changes, the revisions that we made to the affordability requirements, or I should say the affordability allowances. We talked about how the inclusionary zoning can require up to 10% of units to be affordable at 80% AMI in any district. There are two exceptions to that that allow communities to do a little bit more. One of them is by going through another DHCD program such as 4DR or UCTIF. In that case, a community can require up to 20% of units to be affordable and go below 80% AMI if that requirement is separately reviewed and approved by DHCD through that other program. And any community that has an existing 40R district that existed before these guidelines were released and required up to 25% of units to be affordable can keep that requirement in place, and they can even expand that district to meet the rest of the requirements. The other way, if a community wants to require more affordable units and not go through one of those DHCD programs, they can submit a feasibility analysis. It's conducted by an independent third party. It would support the feasibility of multifamily housing in the district. And this is a pretty new revision to the guidelines, so we are going to release more information about exactly what that third party feasibility study would be required to show. We appreciate your patience as we get to that in the near future. And finally, I just want to note in terms of affordability that we removed a prior requirement that any affordable units in 3A districts would have to be eligible for the subsidized housing inventory. They no longer have to be. They can be, but they don't have to be. And that change will allow communities to zone for workforce housing where the AMI is actually over 80%. So you might remember from the language in the statute that there's actually no effective date for Section 3A. Technically, the zoning requirements were in place immediately. Through the guidelines, DHCD offered the MBTA communities some steps they could take to achieve interim compliance with the statute while they work to develop compliant zoning. These interim compliance concepts are intended to offer relief and give the communities a chance to get their zoning in place. Last year, there was a requirement that a community submit a community information form. 95% of the MBTA communities did that and were compliant for 2022. For 2023 and going forward until a community reaches its district compliance deadline, the way to get into interim compliance is to submit an action plan. The action plans for all community categories are due on January 31st of 2023. You can find the action plan on our website, mass.gov/MBTA communities. And I really encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to check out that action plan. It's a pretty light lift. It's really more of a form than a full plan. And it has kind of three components. The first one asks the community to just restate its requirements and make sure we're all on the same page. The second section of it gives the community an opportunity to sort of brainstorm what types of zoning strategies they're thinking about using and provide that to us. It helps us as well to sort of anticipate what kind of compliance applications we're going to get in the future. The specific strategies that are laid out there are by no means binding. They're really just an exercise in brainstorming. The third component is probably the most important of the action plan, and it sets forth the community's schedule for developing its zoning. And that schedule obviously needs to present something that anticipates compliance in time for the deadline. So the action plans, they are light lift. The community will, however, be reviewed for the action that it's taken under its action plan if it applies for some of the grants that are at stake with the statute. So at that time, we at DHCD would look to, not scrutinize to the point that everything went identically to plan, but that the community did generally take the action that it said it was going to take under the action plan. And at this point, I'll turn it back to Chris.
Thanks, Nate. And just for people who have joined us, I just want to let you know we are going to be providing you with this slide deck, which we acknowledge is a little bit dense. And so don't be frantically scribbling notes down. And of course, you have the recording to come back to. So I want to talk a little bit about the compliance model. We mentioned that this is something that's coming out later this month. And I want to give you an overview of how it works. It is required to be submitted with your when you do your district and when you submit your final compliance to DHCD. And this is a tool that will that we are providing all of the pieces to, but each community will be asked to look at their district, put their district onto a GIS shapefile. And in this case, you may come to your regional planning agency GIS staff for some assistance, or hire consultants through some of our technical assistance, which I'll talk about in a minute. But over on the left-hand side, you can see a map that indicates, a possible 3A district. As you can see, it includes some colored areas. These are definitions to the that exist in the guidelines, such as excluded land area and sensitive land area. These GIS databases for all communities will be provided by us and have been developed for every parcel in every community, and they will be posted on our website and available for download. Again, you may get help if you're a larger community and you have GIS staff, you may be able to work with them, and we're hoping you'll be able to work with your RPA GIS experts for assistance. The GIS exercise is in drawing and locating the districts. So obviously that's an important piece. You have some locational requirements and you know where you want to put these multifamily districts. Once that district is drawn, it is exported from that GIS model, and you get a list of all of the parcels that are in that district. Then we turn to the second piece of the compliance model, which is an Excel workbook. It's a pretty fancy Excel workbook, and you will go through a couple steps. And again, we'll have lots of information and user guides. Your RPA staff has actually already received some training on the compliance model, so they can help you with it. You're going to take those parcels that are in your district and copy and paste them into the compliance model. And then you're also going to go through a zoning checklist that asks for some basic parameters about the district, such as what is the minimum lot size, what is the building height, what is your lot coverage requirements, how many parking spaces do you require for multifamily units. All of those categories of zoning parameters will get automatically applied through the formulas that exist in the compliance model. And on the right-hand side, you can see kind of a sample of the results of the compliance model. And these are all things that are important for you to give back to us to show how you're complying. It will give the district acreage. It will show the unit capacity. It will show the density of the district. And it will give, if you have a transit station, it will tell you how much is within that transit station area, as Nate talked about those examples from Arlington and Needham, if Table 2 applies to you. So these are all very important things. This is a high-level overview. This in and of itself is a whole separate webinar and a whole separate training, which will be coming. Again, this will come out later this month, and there'll be other recordings and other information to help walk you through it. But the tools that you need to do all this are being provided to you and will be on our website. Next slide. So I've talked about technical assistance a couple times, and I just want to be clear. It is the program's goal to provide technical assistance to every community who wants it. And in fact, because this is a multi-year effort, we anticipate that it's possible that you may seek technical assistance a couple times, and you may actually get that assistance from a couple different sources. And I'll talk about those sources in a moment. Just to let you know, right now, there are already some really good resources that have been developed. If you're struggling with how to do an action plan, Nate has recorded a webinar as part of the Mass Housing Partnership webinar series that goes through the action plan step by step. And that is on I have Mass Housing Partnership's website on the next slide. And you want to look for the webinar that was October 19th. Another regional planning agency, Southeast Regional Planning and Economic Development District, otherwise known as SERPED, has done some really good webinars in that series that talk about location, especially for communities that are small and adjacent that don't have a location requirement. They've developed some interesting approaches to how you might think about where you might put your multifamily district. So I would commend that to you as well. We're also coming up with a sample bylaw that'll be available sometime in in November, and a user guide that will explain the guidelines in a more practical way. As you know, we understand there are 18 pages of single space legal text, and these webinars are one way to help explain them to you, but we are creating a user guide that you might refer to over and over again or use with your boards and commissions as you work through creating your multifamily district. Next slide. So here's some of the resources that I talked about. One of our primary partners is Mass Housing Partnership, otherwise known as MHP. They are hosting this series of webinars, I believe, that just concluded this week. They're all recorded and they're available through their website. They also are running technical assistance programs. Their current round of technical assistance just closed, I believe, about 10 days ago, and they'll be providing funding and consultant support for communities in their program. They will most likely open that up again next year. Our agency, DHCD, runs 3 different grant programs that all fund 3A compliance activities. I oversee about $11.5 million a year. This year, in the current grant round period, we are giving almost $800,000 in technical assistance for Section 3A compliance to 14 communities. We had 14 applications and we're funding all 14. So next year's Community One-Stop grant round will be available for many communities and to seek funding. And that is money that you get from us to hire a consultant or your regional planning agency, for example, to help you with your compliance activities. Our colleagues at Energy and Environmental Affairs also have a grant program that's setting aside money for MBTA compliance, and they are funding 5 communities in this current grant round. And finally, of course, Karen and Glenn and all the folks at Massachusetts Regional Planning Commission are partners. They will run their district local technical assistance and general assistance that they provide to all of you all the time and support these efforts. Karen may not have wished this on herself, but she has become more of an expert than she was 6 months ago on MBTA communities and these final guidelines. And I think I mentioned already that their staff has been trained on using the compliance model, and that training and that support, that technical support will continue into the future for this GIS compliance model exercise. Next slide, please. So just we hope that in this PowerPoint and this presentation, you've gotten a deeper introduction to Section 3A, what the legislation was and how we've implemented it through the guidelines. You've seen a little bit about the tools that we're releasing and the materials that we're providing, both universal resources like things that are on our website and also technical assistance resources to help you hire consultants or experts to help you with this compliance for this new regulatory program. Again, our main website is mass.gov/MBTA communities. That's where you can find the guidelines and all sorts of resources and links. The table with all of the community requirements is also on the website. And so there's just that's where we'll be posting all of the compliance model information and everything else. So for those of you who are working actively on this, we'd advise that you bookmark that website and go back to it to check for additional resources. And I think with that, Karen, we'll stop our presentation and we'll open it up to the questions and answers.
All right. So we have in here, let's see. If land that is included in an approved zoning district subsequently is purchased by the state, obtains development restrictions or other conditions that would exclude it from meeting the criteria, what happens to the previously achieved compliance with MBTA community zoning? And what steps can be taken or language included to prevent those actions from occurring?
Thank you for your question, Roger. I'm going to take the first stab at that, and Nate can back me up if he has anything else to add. So the statute is about creating the zoning district there, and there is nothing in the compliance guidelines that indicates that we are going to track or monitor or judge production. So while it would be unfortunate if there was a purchase of land in this district that was then further restricted, that is a property owner's right to do, and that can happen. As it can happen in any zoning district currently. I mean, this is just going to be a zoning district that's going to allow for multifamily housing to be developed as of right. In terms of steps to prevent that, I'm not sure. Nate, do you have any reflections?
Just to clarify on the first point, the guidelines do have some discussion of ongoing obligations, but in terms of a district falling out of compliance, the only way that the guidelines anticipate any problem is if it's municipal action that causes that change. If the municipality itself did something that rendered the district non-compliant, then you could worry about a rescission of the compliance. But if it's a different entity or a different type of change, the guidelines don't anticipate going back and monitoring that change. I don't know if I have anything to add about what state steps could be taken to prevent the state from coming in and doing that.
I don't know, Roger, if you had a specific, like if you're worried about state purchase of property in your area. I'm not sure if that's a concern that is local. That's not a question that we've had before.
Oh, they do buy a lot of land. They do take a lot of land out of development potential, and that's
Okay.
The next question, why were municipal boundaries used instead of the proximity to a transit station?
So if I can try and understand this question, and again, Roger, if you want to add any clarifying comments, each municipality is named because the municipality has to be compliant. The statute talks about MBTA communities, which are the communities that have to comply with the regulations. We do use proximity to transit, as you saw in the slideshow, to increase or to provide for increased locational requirements to be near transit. That's consistent with the statute.
I think my question concerns the holes in the map. Residents in those communities may be closer to a transit station, time or distance, than most of the residents in my town.
I see. So you're talking about like Dunstable or Pepperell? Is that what you're
Ashburnham,
talking
we're
about?
30 minutes away from a train station at the end of the line. It's,
Uh-huh.
you know,
Yeah, you are named as an MBTA
yeah.
community, and that is we have no choice other than to apply this as the statute
Yeah.
directs us. I understand your comment is you're far away. I understand that, but
And there's holes in the map.
I understand that as well, because those are not named in Chapter
Yeah,
161A as MBTA communities, and that's really a separate statute that is not under our control.
correct. Yeah, I understand that.
Next question from Becky. Does the GIS model include barriers to development such as endangered species habitat and wetlands?
Can you let Nate take that?
Sure. Can you confirm that I'm not on mute?
You're not on mute.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, playing with the microphone. It does, and it does it in two different ways. There's kind of two categories of those types of lands to have in mind. So the two categories are excluded land and sensitive land. Generally, excluded land is something, wetlands are a really good example of excluded land. Those are lands that we know for a fact are undevelopable, and they're not going to, like, the area of those lands is not going to contribute to your zoning requirements. It's not going to contribute to meeting them. It's not going to contribute to having to do them. It's essentially lands that are ignored. The other type of land is sensitive land. that's land where regulatory controls don't necessarily prohibit the development of the land, but the model wants you to be aware that it's there so that you can make a decision of whether that's the best place to zone for multifamily housing.
I'm the person who asked that question. And I guess I'll just add that in our town, a lot of developers have purchased land thinking it was developable, only to find when they consult with natural heritage that there are endangered species on some or all of, or a lot of this land, and therefore you cannot develop it. And the GIS maps on our town website show all the areas that one might expect to find endangered species. But to get to the level of actually knowing, is development prevented entirely on this parcel or just only on part of it, you have to go consult with natural heritage. I can't imagine that you're going to have done that for this GIS project.
No, that's right. And the same concept can apply to different matters of, septic systems or something like that. We're not going to have done a soil test all around the state. So the model anticipates those issues as best as it can, but there probably are realities out there like that where, we just won't know.
Yeah, can I just add on to that, Nate, that, it's all of the known databases that are being used. And Title V, I believe, Nate, is one of them, right? That's included as a constraint.
Yeah, the Title V setbacks are shown.
So Becky, what community are you from?
Groton.
Groton. Thank you. So again, we think that the compliance model, and again, we realize we're talking right now in the abstract until it's released and you can see your community's land maps and how they match up with your maps, but there may be better and worse places for you to locate your district. And so the guidelines ask is that you consider sensitive lands and as you think about where your district might be located.
Right. I actually have the next question in there too, which is I think as somebody who's paid fairly close attention and been involved for a number of years in Groton, I think pretty much I'm not on the planning board and no one from our planning board is on this webinar tonight, probably because they meet on Thursday nights. But I think most people recognize that there are only really two potential locations for an MBTA housing choice district in Groton. So my next question is pertinent. One of those, let's read it. One of those is already in the planning process for a 40B development. So my question is, if the 40B development proceeds, can we then legally create it as a housing choice district, and would DHCD approve that?
Okay, I'll take this one. So from a 3A perspective, in terms of the zoning only, you can do that. It's a measurement of what the zoning allows, and it doesn't matter what's on the lot. There is one thing to be aware of when you think about zoning in 40Bs. You might hear about this discussed in the planning community. It's a case called, I don't even remember which community it was in, but the Ardmore case. And I'm not going to provide a legal summary of it. I'm just going to try to describe the subject matter that's at stake. It's a case in which the holding made planners wonder if you were to create zoning under a 40B project, if that would allow the property owner to remove the affordability restrictions. I'd suggest consulting with local counsel to figure out, to get some advice on that specific topic, but it's just something that you should be aware of when you think about whether you want to zone under a 40B.
Well, I mean, we don't have the choice of zoning under 40B, as you know. the developer proceeds with that. It's just whether we could use that as our MBTA housing choice district if he's already building his 40B on it.
Becky, let me take a crack at answering. And Nate is absolutely accurate. With you should consult with your town council, but you
Right.
must establish a multifamily zoning district where multifamily is allowed by right. That is the action that the town must take to comply with Section 3A. So we understand in 40B you do not control the zoning. It allows somebody to ignore your local zoning. But what 3A requires is that you do establish a multifamily zoning district with all of the of reasonable size. It doesn't prevent children, families with children,
Right.
etc.
Right.
So you will have to take an action to make a zoning. And then when Nate is saying, you might want to make sure you check with town council before you zone the property that has been developed or has a comprehensive permit approved by your ZBA. You want to approach that carefully, is all Nate is saying. And that you could do that if you met if you met all the requirements and you put it through and it met the size requirements and you may not have size requirements, but it met your density requirements and it met the unit capacity requirements. So that so you do have to take an action to zone for multifamily by right.
Right. Thank you.
Sorry. Next from Jeff. Land in active agricultural use is listed in the definition of sensitive land. How should communities treat parcels that are currently enrolled in Chapter 61A tax program? And what if those parcels account for most or all of their proposed designated zones?
Go ahead, Nate.
I thought you were going. So you're right there. Those lands are designated as sensitive lands. They're not excluded lands, meaning that a community is permitted to zone there. Obviously, those lands could come back into development potential, and that's why they're given that designation. Um, in terms of the second question, I really recommend some of the local specific issues are kind of difficult on the spot when we don't know exactly what the conditions are in a given community. We have an email address that's really the best resource for those specific local technical questions where we could take a look at something. I can add that address to the chat. It's dhcd3a@mass.gov. If you do have any question like that that's specific to your community, I really encourage anybody to reach out to us there. We don't exactly get back the same day, but we get to it as soon as we can and try to provide an answer that's really specific to your community.
Thank
Did
you.
you
I
have any
appreciate that.
follow-up, Jeff? Jeff, did you have any follow-up?
No, I just wanted to say thank you. Appreciate the answer, and we'll follow up by email as we learn more and move forward in the process.
Sure,
Okay.
thanks.
Next, as a member of the Groton Housing Authority, I have been told that our housing subsidy could be significantly reduced if our community is non-compliant. Where can I find specific information on whether this is true and if it is what its impact would be?
Thank you very much for your question. It is true that currently the funding source that we're talking about here, as you saw in the statute, is called the Local Capital Projects Fund. That is in the statute as one of the funds that is at risk if you are non-compliant with the guidelines. In order to, we have to follow the law at DHCD. We cannot make our own decisions and say that we don't like what the legislature said. We have to follow what the legislature wrote. And that is what they wrote. And furthermore, after they wrote that, for the last several years, they have appropriated, including in fiscal 23, the current budget year that we're in, they appropriated a line item at DHCD which funds the operating subsidies for public housing authorities, that is administered by DHCD, by our Public Housing Authority division. That line item, which is an operating budget, is made up of two funding sources. One is general government funds, and one is the local capital projects fund. The local capital projects fund, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to get into a little bit of state budget detail here, and I apologize, but try and stay with me. That makes up approximately 10% of the funding that is available for housing authorities. The source of the local capital projects fund, it's given in the statute as a very long source. It is 4.5% of the resort casinos funds that come to the Commonwealth. When the Commonwealth adopted the legislation that allows for the resort casinos, that's the MGM in Springfield and the Encore in Everett, it made a pie of where all and it negotiated and said a lot of revenues, portions of revenues from those casinos are going to come to the state, and it divvied them up into some are going to go for transportation improvements, some are going to go to local governments, and this is the local capital projects fund is one piece of that gave the legislature the ability to appropriate it as it saw fit. What they've done in the last several years, again, including the current year, is take that and fund the housing, use it to fund a portion, again, approximately 10% of the housing authority line item. We had 9 communities that were not compliant in 2022. Nate went over that in one of the slides. 6 of those 9 communities have local housing authorities, and those local housing authorities were informed in September that they would have to create their budget for the next year with a reduction of 10% because the communities in which they are did not comply. They did not submit a community information form. Everybody in the Massachusetts region submitted a community information form. That was the bar for compliance. Those 6 communities chose not to do that. One of those communities has since come into interim compliance by submitting an action plan. Any community that is faced, and this was articulated to the communities that were informed that their housing authorities would have to budget for a 10% reduction. The communities were informed that they could come into compliance by submitting an action plan. At this point, nobody other than one of them has submitted that action plan, but that is a cure right now for those existing districts. What I cannot say, and I appreciate that this is a difficult conversation, I don't know what the legislature is going to do with its appropriations next year. We can never predict. I don't know. Earlier this year, we couldn't predict because we didn't know what they were going to adopt in their fiscal year 23 budget. But they did include that local capital projects fund as 10% of housing authority funding. So I can't tell you into the future what it might be because I don't know what the legislature is going to do. What I can do is encourage your community to take the step to fill out an action plan and achieve interim compliance. And for that, if they do that, then you will not be in the problem of facing a potential reduction. I just don't know what's going to happen with the legislature next year.
This is Fran Stanley in Groton. I'm the housing coordinator. I'm kind of astounded by that. John Saka mentioned that last night at a housing trust meeting, and he'd heard it as a board member for the housing authority. Are the local capital projects fund, is that regular capital improvements like, painting or new roof or windows, or is it?
That's just the name of the fund, Fran. It's just the name of the fund. It actually, it's an operating subsidy. It's an operating budget fund.
Okay.
And it makes up 10% of what DHCD's public housing division gets to pass through. We pass through all the money to the housing authorities. We pass that through. In order to apply the law, we have to tell communities that are not compliant that their housing authorities face this potential loss.
Sure.
It's not, we have to follow the law, and
No, I understand you have to follow the law.
Doesn't feel good for a housing agency to have to tell housing authorities this, but we feel our legal interpretation is that we do not have a choice, because if we did not do it, we would be non-compliant with the law.
I completely understand you have to follow the law. I think it's really core by the legislature to withdraw its regular operating subsidies, because in some sense it's just the name of a fund. It's not like it's an extra
Yeah.
or an optional thing. But thank you for explaining it.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I'm sorry it takes so long because it's complicated, and it's possible that it could change next year with the legislature being made aware of this mismatch with this statute and what they're adopting in the budget.
And my question basically is, how do we, the housing authority, detract what this potential impact is? You have a
Yeah,
tough time following it. You're in direct contact with the legislature and knowledgeable people in the government. We're volunteers sitting out here in the hinterland trying to run some subsidized housing and being threatened with the loss of our support, or at least at the present time, 10%. 10% is appreciated as now a known number. All I heard significant reduction, and that's certainly more than 10%. So
it.
we're not attacking DHCD. We're not
Yep.
challenging DHCD. We're merely asking DHCD to give us the guidance we need in order
Yep.
to appropriately lobby and direct the attention of our community to any future failure. We are in compliance now, and we fully expect to remain in compliance, through 2025 and beyond. But
Great.
we, the housing authority, are not in charge of any of that.
I understand.
So how do we communicate to the people who are making decisions along the way what the impact is likely to be on our mission in their community? Thank you.
You're welcome, John. And so you can just communicate a general concern that they stay in compliance. I have learned more about housing authority budgeting process than I knew before. And like Karen, learning about the compliance model and other pieces of this new program, it's extremely complicated. So John, what I would recommend at this point is that if there is staff or whether it's Fran or staff from the housing authority, to communicate with their folks in DHCD's Public Housing Authority division and ask about that, ask this question to them. The budgeting is extremely complex, and it does vary depending on whether you have federal units or state units and what mix you have, and it's quite complicated. So that would be my suggestion, John, is that you ask your housing authority staff to provide you with an estimate at this time. But maybe by the time
we have the part-time assistance of a single administrator or director of housing who is shared with 2 other communities. But Thank you. We'll do what we can. I understand.
Thanks, John. Thanks for the question. I appreciate being able to actually have some ability to describe it for you guys in detail.
We have another question from Roger. Can the 5-acre minimum be comprised of multiple lots? I don't see why not. The small center of town is the recommended location as there is no land within half a mile of the station. The lots are historically small. How is this addressed?
I'll take that one. That was from my segment. I'll try to explain more clearly the 5-acre requirement. It applies, and my dog's trying to explain it for me. It applies to a contiguous geography of the zoning district. It doesn't apply to it doesn't apply to single parcels. So whether that 5 acres was 1 parcel or 10 parcels doesn't matter. In order to contribute to a minimum land area requirement for the district, that piece of the district has to be 5 acres. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, I think I was confused by what was in the original guidelines and such. It's probably been filtered out to make more sense now. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
This is Claire Frieda, City Councilor from Leominster. I'm also a 30-year member of the Mass Municipal Association Board of Directors, and we've worked pretty closely with Mass Lawyers Association and Michael Keneally and the whole issue when this first came about. And I absolutely agree with you and sympathize with you, Chris, don't shoot the messenger, because that is what you have to do at this point. And I think the legislators need to going back to that original question, the legislators need to pay attention to their own communities and find out with the housing authorities. And if I understand correctly, there's also MassWorks grants that are jeopardized. I could be wrong on that, but I think if a community is not in compliance, there's a lack of mass grant opportunities for the community as well. Am I correct on that?
Yes, you are. And that's pretty clear. Those are a little bit easier for us to describe. MassWorks infrastructure grants, which are the biggest grants that the state gives out. It's $100 million every year given out to communities across the Commonwealth. So if you are non-compliant, you would not be eligible for those funds. And also housing choice grants. Housing choice is a program that rewards communities that are building housing at a relatively fast rate, looking back over 5 years. And those are grants up to $250,000 that are given out every year. About $4 million every year are given out in capital grants. I'm not sure how many of those communities, if you have any housing choice designated communities in your region. But anyway, that's the second grant fund. MassWorks is certainly the most significant grant fund that is in the statute as a penalty for noncompliance.
And it just seems to be counterintuitive sometimes, because I think we're fortunate enough to have some large MassWorks grants in Leominster to build affordable housing. And we've been very successful at it. We're only at 8%, but there are some communities that are just, at 175, there are some that just aren't going to be able to be compliant, or are going to have a very difficult time being compliant. And I know they have to be compliant, but that's a very difficult position to be in. This really wasn't well thought out, I don't think, and I think it's still got a long way to go. And again, I'm not shooting the messenger. I think we're all trying to understand it and work together to see what we can do. But it certainly is still a big issue. It's a big issue for us, and I've also been a real estate appraiser for 42 years, and it just seems that we chip away at neighborhoods. We almost encourage people to be anti-40B, and anti-programs that are going to help the communities, because people they're afraid to buy a property, even if they're next door to a residential area. That 5 years from the time they move in, there's been many times that a planning board will look at something and change the zoning. So as an appraiser or a broker, it's very important to look at what the zoning issues are. And there should be a sense of security that that's where you bought, but now that can change. And it does change. So I just think there's another way that this could have all been done, to incentivize it differently, maybe to incentivize developers. I don't know. I don't have the answer, so I get it. But I think there's just some real issues all the way around with it. Just my opinion.
Thanks for your comments, Claire. I appreciate it.
I would add a little bit to the conversation we were just having a little while ago. Certainly until yesterday, when John Sokka mentioned it at a meeting, my understanding was that really the only loss, if we did not comply with this, would be the MassWorks grants, which frankly we've had one of in my entire 48 years in Groton. But the lack of money for our housing authority is an entirely different matter. And I think that if it appears that that's going to continue, it's incumbent and important for DHCD to publicize that information to everyone, because that may be why those other towns didn't bother to file a certificate of compliance.
I appreciate that, Becky. Nate and I reached out to all of those communities and tried very hard to communicate with them about the consequences, and it did not make a difference.
Oh, okay.
But
It
I
certainly,
appreciate
it certainly does in our town. It's an important consideration.
of course.
The other thing I would say, and I understand again, you're not the legislature, and they do some pretty crazy things, it sounds like, but it's frustrating that you opened this program by sort of reviewing the history of some of the housing, pro-housing and pro-affordable housing stuff that has happened over the years. And I think for me, the most dispiriting aspect of the MBTA housing choice is the only 10% affordable when we're behind on our subsidized housing inventory. And so why not make it the same 25% as a 40B, or at least 20%? There's no way that we're going to ever make progress on coming into compliance if there's more building at only 10%, because that's not going to make us get to 10%.
As an argument to that, I think the problem is that Massachusetts doesn't have enough housing, and so developers are more likely incentivized to build more of it if they are able to make more money. And so Massachusetts will be more likely to get more housing faster without having affordability restrictions.
Well, there's plenty of high-end housing being built in Groton. We don't need anybody to incentivize people to build high-end housing in Groton. But what we do need, and I know that I frequently see that missing middle phrase thrown around as a kind of housing, but it's really the missing middle of between really high-end housing and subsidized housing, that housing that is affordable to people who are early career, workforce maybe is the right term, but that's not being built, and there's no incentives. You know, if a developer's going to build in Groton, they're going to build high-end because they can make a lot of money. If there's an incentive, we do have inclusionary zoning at 15%, but if your subdivision is only 9 units, you don't have to do it. So you see a lot of 9-unit subdivisions of really high-end housing.
Right. And I mean, the point is not that we want to discourage building more houses in Massachusetts. It's that we want a balanced program that builds housing for all of our citizens, not just the ones that will make the developers richest. And this does not support that. Thank you.
I do want to raise one other issue with noncompliance that I haven't mentioned. And again, this is between you and your town councils or your city solicitors. The statute in our administration's perspective is that it is a requirement and that there is potentially some legal liability if you do not comply, that somebody will say you are not in compliance, not the state, but that somebody will have standing to say that you're not in compliance, and there's a law that says you must have this district and you do not have the district. So I didn't want to not state that because that is the administration's position.
Sure.
Again, we are not going to come after you, but a developer, for example, might see that there is a no compliance and could potentially bring suit.
You answered about I was like, who could possibly have standing if the Commonwealth's not bringing the action? but it still has to go through the town meeting, which is what's tough about this, because you know, if the state wants it, then it could have been state zoning the same way 40B is. But you know, I think Groton has a path to pass it, and has plenty of incentive to pass it. Thank you.
I could say, I think on our end, the Mass Work grants and things, we've finally gotten our head out of the sand, our act together, and we're applying for these things. they're essential for us being able to accommodate, more housing.
Mm-hmm.
And the difficult part is we could go through this whole process and have it fail at town meeting. And then we are not eligible for things that are helping us get to where we can accommodate this. It's kind of a duality there of you're cutting our legs off at the same time with these penalties. And that's really the issue. And it's going to be hard to convince the voters of something that we may or may not get for grants.
Mm-hmm.
Roger, what community are you from?
Ashburnham.
Nice, thank you.
And, another thing I could say is the rail line that could go out to North Adams whenever that is done, that's proposed, goes through town. There's a lot of state-owned land bordering that rail line. It has a great potential that way for this housing because it's closest to the rail line, it's closest to the main roads. But it's ineligible at this point. Is there any way, how do we go about, future considering that potential, that it's either industrial land along the rail line or it's on the passenger rail line that could be developed in the future?
Well, Ashburnham is a small town that does not have a location requirement, so you can put your multifamily district wherever you'd like.
Except we can't consider state-owned land.
Well, right, no, that's true.
That's
Public land
that's
is
the issue
excluded.
that, there's
Yes.
large parcels of land abutting to train tracks that could become future passenger rail lines, and we can't use that.
Well, that's true.
Because Ashburnham is farther away, our land requirements rather small. I think we'll be able to meet the requirement with some of the land that we've already been considering.
I'm just trying to think future down the road, what's the best way to do that helps in the future, not just meeting compliance requirements.
Right. Isn't Roger saying that the best place to put the housing is near the transit station, if and when the transit station is built? But the land nearest the likely potential transit station location is ineligible. This seems contradictory to the natural objectives of the legislature. Now, that's not a DHCD issue, but it is an issue with the topic we're discussing. Thank you.
That is a good point. Do we know where the state is going to put that future transit station?
I don't, there's no mention of a future transit station. It's just along passenger rail, has, maybe they would do that, maybe not, but it's just, you look at the map and you go, wow, that would be potentially a great place. And it's, far in the future possibly, but it's,
Yeah.
And if the zoning were already in place and that along the rail line, that would increase the likelihood that a station might be placed where the density is highest. But we're not allowed to, Ashburnham is not allowed to use that.
If I may offer from MRPC, hi, it's Glenn. I apologize, I'm having a camera hardware problem. If I may offer, just on the tangential point of future transit stations, if that ever happens, oh God, when did they close the Gardner station? But the long story short of this is that there was a station in Gardner that was the terminus of the rail more than 25 years ago. And I'm really dating myself. I'm afraid to calculate the date and the number because then I really realize how old I am. But the reality is that the Wachusett station where the train set is stored in Westminster, but the station is actually in Fitchburg, is the current terminus of the longest commuter rail line that MBTA has from North Station to Fitchburg. If it goes beyond that, there's always been talk in feasibility studies, but the higher density point is valid. Typically, stations don't happen in the rural communities. They typically are in the Gardners. The next logical one may be Athol or Orange, and then you have Greenfield and then North Adams. So for what it's worth, we're off point, but I just thought I'd throw that in there. Thank you
Yeah,
for your time.
yeah. And that's what that study that led to Wachusett Station factored into, that the travel time was just too far if you're
So,
going to Boston. But if you're going towards, any of these other communities that are along rail lines, isn't just destination isn't Boston. Could be any community that's accessible along the rail line.
so I have a somewhat similar question. In Groton, we have a large amount of land that's owned by New England Power, which is also National Grid, apparently. I don't know whether that land is going to show up as excluded, but they own that land because they don't want anybody to build housing on it. But so I guess the question is, will land that's owned by the utilities, will that show up as excluded on those maps?
I believe so. Not necessarily every piece of land that's owned by a utility company, but I think, Chris, you can help me if I'm off on this. I think that major pieces like that were excluded.
I think that's something you're gonna have to look at when you get your the maps that are available as part of the compliance model. You could check that. What I could say from our point of view is that we, on reviewing the districts that are submitted to us, we're looking at the results of the compliance model, we're looking at the text of the zoning bylaw, we're looking at the location of the station. In small adjacent communities, there is not a location requirement, nor is there a minimum land area. However, if it's underneath power lines, that may not meet the goals of the program. But if it's Becky, you're just gonna have to look. I'm not sure we can tell you right now. I think it's possible that there was some private institutional land, for example, the high school that you have, the private high school in Groton. I think that's excluded because there's an assumption that it will remain a private high school. Public town-owned lands are excluded. In the compliance model, there is a way to override what is, quote, excluded land if you can demonstrate that it is ripe for development. For example, many towns convert old school buildings into housing. Drake just did this. Almost every community has probably done it. And so that might be publicly owned land at the time of the 2021 parcel base, which is what we're using. But if if it's been surplus at town meeting, or it's being, a request for proposals from developers is being issued, those are good reasons why you could say, hey, this is not excluded and we can expect a certain amount of development, and we want to count it for our unit capacity. That is possible. So there is some tailoring of these maps that you can do at the
Okay.
local level to accommodate that kind of thing.
All right, well, so I've recorded this. It'll be on our website along with the slides. Um,
Karen, I'd just like to make a comment to thank Nathan and Chris. I know the objective was to come out and help us all learn how to be compliant and to help us in any way you can. I think some of us maybe took the conversation a little left or right, but I understand why you were here, and appreciate taking the time tonight, and for MRPC for putting it together.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. I appreciate that. It's really been this happens to be the very last of our regional webinars. We've spoken to about 1,800 people. And I think having come from local government and now working at the state, I think it's really important that people in local government have access to their state officials and be able to have these conversations. We may not agree all the time, but I do think it's valuable. So thank you so much for your time tonight, for coming out or coming into your living room and joining us for the conversation.
Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you, everyone. Have a
Thank
good
you.
night. Happy
Thank
Thanksgiving.
you.